Right.
They see Islam as inherently regressive, requiring submission. These are not ideas that they're comfortable with. And generally within the left, there's a popular idea of religion being the opium of the masses. It's not something that can liberate or, something that we should aspire towards. Um,
Mm.
so given that and the fact that you write about an anarcha Islam, how do we address the challenges that we face from the left, from anarchists, and the fact that they might not be welcoming of a religion?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. And let me start off by um, going back to the original, because again, it's a matter of language, right? It's a matter of, and again, language is imbued with knowledge. I'm not just being facetious here. Islam is often mistranslated as, again, we talked about Dawda, we talked about a lot of terms, as submission. The term for submission, or the word for submission at Islam, is actually khudu' in Arabic, right? If you translate khudu', that means submission in English. Islam actually means, as Amina Wadud, as other scholars had pointed out, as I write, as well for surrender, because it comes from the root three-letter word or verb, sallama, to give oneself, to willfully surrender. And to surrender upon, as the Quran says, أَلَا يَتَفَكَّرُونَ أَلَا يَفْقَهُونَ, to do not think, to reflect. So it's not a matter of just blind surrender. But this is why I say willful surrender, right? So the politics of mistranslation, this becomes a huge thing, whether it's to Muslims, as we discussed, or whether it's to anarchists. But Muslims have also internalized a lot of misconceptions with regards to anarchism. So when anarchism is translated into Arabic, right, and I'll speak just for Arabic, it's often translated as it is in English, as chaos, as anarchy. The Arabic term is fawdawi. But as Hiba Rauf Izzat, who is a professor here at the University of Cairo, the actual correct translation is La Sultawiyya, without authority, right, without rule. So there's that point, the politics of mistranslation, that becomes a huge problem that Joseph Masad, that Sabah Mahmoud, the late Sabah Mahmoud, South Asian scholar, had noted, as well as Gayatri Spivak, and so on and so forth, another South Asian scholar. And when we mistranslate things, we are doing violence to language. This is part of the problem, is that we're assuming that we can translate anything from Urdu, from Hindi, from Arabic, and there's the synonymous term that we can use in English, but forcing again a particular meaning or definition or congruency with a noun-based language, which is what English means, is a form of violence within itself. So again, this speaks to violence. This speaks to the part of the problem that we're at, right? And part of the crisis of identity and knowledge that we're facing at this moment. The element of anti-spirituality isn't exclusive to, obviously, anarchists. We know that it exists without Marxists, right? Perhaps anarchists have actually been, and this is the irony, right, more open than Marxists have been to this discussion, right? At least in the recent contemporary. Because again, it's ironic that you would find that leftists would uphold Malcolm, would uphold Martin, not Turner, even somebody like Kwame Ture, who are spiritual, who are revolutionary, who are leftists, right? When they're born, when they die, commemorate their assassination and so on and so forth, but don't understand the value of engaging in that political theology, that you will never be able to achieve anything as a secular left insofar as because we're spiritual beings. How can you love without spirit? How can you engage in revolution without spirit? How can you die without spirit? How can you connect with land that is all about spirit, right? So secularism comes out of a Euro-American Christian ethos, a liberal paradigm that sought to preserve Christianity or Euro-American Christianity, again, while murdering God equally at the same time, in a certain sense, as well, Halak had put forward. White camouflaging God, let's put it that way, right? A God we trust on the $1 bill, but the liberal God is the liberal God, and the Christian God, again, it's a terra nullius, it's manifest destiny, the doctrines of discovery, right? Indigenous people referred to as savages and heathens, Black people, the same thing. And before them, it was Muslims and Jews, right? So there's a logic there, right, to the religious liberal arc. But within anarchisms, then we have examples, and there were a lot of Jewish anarchists, Emma Goldman, Bakunin, Kropotkin, that disavowed in a certain sense, right? They're, let's say, religious Judaism, right? Because of its certain internalized conceptualizations of religion, anthropological meanings of it, and authoritarian tendencies that exist within it. Despite the fact that Judaism is anti-clerical, it doesn't have a clergy, it doesn't have a priesthood. The same thing with, insofar as Islam, as we discussed, right? But there wasn't an understanding of the significance of it. Of course, we have Tolstoy, we have Jacques Ellul, we have Dorothy Day. These are examples of Christian anarchists equally at the same time, right? But there is a refusal because out of a fear, because most anarchists, and let's not kid ourselves, particularly in the global north, tend to be white. And they've grown in Catholic and Protestant households. And that is the only form of religion that they have been exposed to. They've internalized certain stereotypes, certain microfascisms that they're refusing to contend with. And this is why I continue to say, you know, microfascism is mass psychology. Anarchists have engaged in Islamophobic practices and sexist practices and racist practices and misogynistic practices. So let's not be almighty and all holy. But over the past 12, 13 years, really, when we gathered together in Loughborough, there was an anarchist studies network conference that actually we got together. This was around 2010, 2011. And several editions of religious anarchism, several books had come out: Jewish anarchism, Muslim anarchism, Buddhist anarchism, Taoist anarchism, Christian anarchism, to begin to undo that within anarchist movements. I've yet to see that within Marxism. Of course, we do have spiritual Marxists. Again, we do have the example of Ali Shariati, which is perhaps the most infamous, right? Most famous, and so on. But, you know, like I said, I do have an issue insofar as Marxism and Islam, particularly insofar as, again, how Islam is anti-authoritarian. And I think that's something that Marxists have not yet paid attention to insofar as power and the question of power in relationship to the state, in relationship to hierarchies. And from an Islamic perspective, liberation theology, again, Islam is not only anti-materialist and anti-capitalist, it is also very much non-authoritarian. It is anti-authoritarian. So part of, I guess, why some anarchists have, and alhamdulillah, I've been on quite a few podcasts, some have been receptive, some have not, have engaged in this reactionary reading of the book, an Orientalist and Islamophobic reading of the book, is because they expected the book to be a historiography of anarchist examples within Muslim history, right? But that wasn't, there are people that have already done that. That's not interesting to me. To me, it's developing the political theology, using the Quran, because that doesn't exist, as a matter of fact, like the Quranic interpretation that actually shows, listen, from a theological interpretation, this is how Islam can be. Even if you disagree with it, that's fine. But that becomes the realm of debate and discussion, right? And disagreement. But this is how a Quranic reading can be anti-authoritarian, can be anti-capitalist or non-capitalist. Here are the principles, here are the concepts. Right? Because listen, we could sit down and talk about how Islam is anti-materialist and give examples of history, but where is the theology? Where is the word of Allah in all this, in adjudicating between us, right? So as Prophet Muhammad was told, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. This is why the book becomes so central and important. But this is where at least some anarchists have reacted by saying, oh, and of course, they don't speak Arabic. They never learned Arabic. They never studied Islamic studies, and they acknowledge all that. This is the facade of it. And they claim to not be Islamophobic, but say, oh, but look at this verse in the Quran. It's sexist, or it's misogynist, or it's, you know, extolling Muslims to kill kafirs and so on. And it's just like, well, then you ignored my entire chapter 2, where I'm talking about the methodology of Islamic studies and jihad and so on and so forth, because what you just did is, least of which is a racist reading, because ultimately you just acknowledge you don't read Arabic, you don't speak, you have never studied, you've never engaged, and so on and so forth, and yet you're cherry picking verses of the Quran and taking them completely out of context. And you're going beyond the scope of what I'm arguing at this point in this moment in time. Again, you've left my non-authoritarian and my non-capitalist argument, and you're focusing on gender and queerness. I'm getting to that point, but that's another project that I'm working on, or have worked on, insofar as what I wrote my PhD on, which is an extension of this, but I had to start with the primary pillars, which is non-capitalism and non-authoritarianism, right? Again, those are what structure gender and queerness, and so on and so forth. It's not the other way around. So, you know, there's relearning, there's unlearning, there's unsettling that has to happen on both ends. Muslims re-understanding why Islam is not only anti-materialist, but why it's also non-authoritarian. But then they need to go back and to be challenged and to think through what governance actually means, what authoritarian actually means historically, but also in the contemporary, given that, again, capitalism, nation states did not exist 1,444 years ago, right? So how have we transitioned from an age of ummas to the age of capitalist nation states now, and what's the difference between here and there, even if there were authoritarian tendencies? And yes, I'm not romanticizing Muslim history. Muslims have done a lot of wrong, and not only towards themselves, but at least power is more fluid in pre-modern times, insofar as Muslim geographies were concerned. They were able, because the way that Muslims were able to contest power of a despot, of al-Ma'mun, or whoever it is that was in power, or Muawiyah, sorry, not al-Ma'mun, but Muawiyah, for instance, a despotic Muslim leader, was precisely by saying, you know what, this is not the Islamic theological interpretation, and no, Islam is against despotism and authoritarianism, and you have strayed, O Muawiyah, from the path, right? So this is how, even when people didn't stray from the path, this is how Aisha was able to meet Ali radiallahu anhu. Could you imagine, the cousin of the Prophet and the wife of the Prophet meeting on a battlefield? This is how they were able to have that confrontation, because of the death of Uthman radiallahu anhu and Ali choosing to forgive his assassins. And you know, if at the end of the day, and this even goes to prove that these khulafa weren't, again, rulers in the meaning of rulers, right, in terms of absolute rulerships and absolute decision makers and so on and so forth, the fact that 3 out of 4 of them were assassinated. That is by the will of Allah. But this is what allowed power to continue to remain asymmetric and dynamic, because so long as it's asymmetric and dynamic, that means you're able to challenge it. You, as far as me, as Muhammad, as being nobodies within society. And it's the right of a nobody to challenge a somebody. But then, the moment that you crystallize that power in hierarchies and so on, as we discussed earlier, it becomes more difficult. It's more difficult for me, if I'm a Cuban, to challenge Castro, to challenge Maduro. Who am I? Especially if I'm nobody. If I'm queer, if I'm trans, if I'm poor, if I'm a single mother, or all these things all at once. And an anarchist. So this becomes the conundrum, right? How can anybody be able to challenge a somebody that has become somebody because the order in which power has become established within society made them into a somebody, such that the hero has become now the villain, right? So this becomes the question. Now, anarchists have something to learn from Muslims too. The left generally does, as a matter of fact. Leftists don't have an ethics of disagreements. Anarchists hate on Marxists, Marxists hate on anarchists and feminists, and so on. The circle keeps on going on and on and on, because everybody's caught in ideologies. Now, I'm non-ideological. I don't believe in ideologies. Why? Because what I'm ultimately arguing is that Islam is inherently anarchistic. The irony, again, with calling myself a Muslim anarchist or an anarchist Muslim, means that one has to come before the other. But when I'm silent about those two, it's only that those two are in unison. Does that make sense? When they're quieted within me, or when I'm engaging in propaganda of the deed, because I'm acting as a Muslim and I'm acting as an anarchist. So to me, Islam is inherently anarchistic. Yeah, okay, I write down Islamic anarchism, but in a certain sense, that's also to address discourses, audiences, movements, and so on. So it's a play that way, a discursive one at best. But it means absolutely nothing when I inherently believe that Islam is anarchistic. So, but the left has something to learn from Muslims with regards to not only spirituality. Again, there's a legacy of BIPOC people that are leftists, Marxists, and anarchists that are spiritual. I have named a bunch of them. But also the fact that Islam has developed an ethics of disagreement, as referred to as usul al-ikhtilaf, which I discuss, and usul al-diyafa, which is the ethics of hospitality. How are you supposed to engage in a protest with other people that you're in kinship, you're in allyship with, without offering hospitality to one another, without engaging in diyafa with one another? And in Islam, that's huge. The guest, if I am a host, the guest, I am responsible for that guest. And you talk about indigenous people and diasporas, particularly diasporic settlers. How are we acting as adequate guests towards our hosts? And in Islam, the host you have to feed, you have to clothe, you have to shelter the guest for at least 3 nights in certain oral traditions, right? You don't even interrogate them with regards to their name, because that may be an act of violence. They may not want to reveal their name for whatever, because they are oppressed or because they're running away from certain despotic orders or certain oppression. The name is to be solicited, is to be given at will, not at the ends of the barrel of a gun, so to speak. The moment of getting to know one another is a very magical moment, because it's a moment that creator, that the ancestor bring us together in. And anything can attract and repel to people. My smell, my odor, something I said inadvertently, the way that I looked at you, whatever. I could have had a bad day, for all you know. But subhanAllah, this is where the spirit comes in, right? This is where I said that a revolution has to also allow room for al-ghayb, the unknown, the spiritual world to teach us something, which is non-human life to teach us as subjects. So this becomes something that's very fundamental, I think, in terms of, again, something that anarchists can learn from, leftists can learn from, in terms of us not tearing one another apart. Because whether or not Muslims apply this usul al-ikhtilaf, that's a different question, because we don't. Right? But there is an ethics of conflict resolution. It exists in Chiapas. It exists within all kinds of movements like Corico, for instance, in Chiapas, conflict resolution mechanisms, and so on and so forth. And feminists have contributed to it, and so on and so forth. But this is the problem with the ego. This is the problem that, no, I'm not going to talk to you because you're a Marxist, I'm an anarchist, you're a Muslim, and I'm an atheist, and so on and so forth. And again, that's a problem of language, because we've internalized certain stereotypes of one another, and we refuse to read. We're stuck in a schizophrenic world in which we're just reacting over 140 characters, right? Because we're so insecure, so fearful. We can't take on the state. We can't eliminate oppression. So who will we take it out on? One another. This is what I mean. And we don't understand the struggle then means that it is between us, not beyond us.
Well, you've